I would like to thank Gina Cavallo and Kate of the New Jersey Coalition Against Human Trafficking for their hard work in arranging this presentation. It is such an important topic in the anti-trafficking field that receives so little attention. So this is a two-part series. Today we will be discussing identifying characteristics of familial trafficking, and tomorrow we will discuss intervention and recovery. All right, let's begin. So I do want to take a moment to discuss the importance of mindfulness before we get started. Just as a warning, we are entering into a conversation about family members in the United States who sell young children for sexual purposes and monetary gain. So please take good care of yourself, being mindful if you start to feel emotional or numb. Some suggestions if you do start to feel this way: refocusing on your breath, engaging your senses through taste, touch, and smell. And last, through movement. You can take a break, stretch, or go on a walk, and that can assist you if you become dysregulated. And I also wanted to include NAMI's crisis line here in case you need to talk to someone immediately. That number is 1-800-273-TALK. All right. Oh, there's me. All right, so just a moment to assess where the current thinking is involving the commercial exploitation of young children. So who do you think is producing child sex abuse material? Where do you think the children come from? So let's formally define familial trafficking as family members or caregivers selling their children for money, drugs, or something else of value. This includes the manufacturing and exchanging of child sex abuse material, even if cash is not involved. Such material is valuable in its own right. This is a low frequency, high impact crime. So what do I mean by this? Well, while research tends to have very low sample sizes, these crimes have a pervasive impact on the child, permanently altering their development and life trajectory, making it one of the most severest forms of child victimization known in our country. So now, similar to other forms of child abuse, most exploitation of young children occurs at the hands of a trusted family member. It is just extremely rare that a child is kidnapped and exploited by a stranger. So does this really happen? Well, yes, it does. So while there is acknowledgement in the anti-trafficking field that familial sex trafficking does occur, when we describe the ways in which traffickers exploit children, we almost always describe methods that are used by boyfriends, pimps, and strangers. However, familial trafficking does happen. It is well documented, and it is one of the officially recognized forms of sex trafficking by the United States government. So, how often does this happen? Well, despite an explosion of concern, particularly in the last few years, fueled by disinformation about complex child sex trafficking schemes involving kidnapping, data shows that victims usually know and trust their traffickers. In fact, proximity tends to be the most important factor in trafficking cases, familial or otherwise. Human trafficking just does not happen within a vacuum. Everyone has a clear and identifiable vulnerability that can be preyed upon, and children are no exception. So due to the lack of research we have on this topic, prevalence of familial trafficking is not well known. Most say that the data we do have is an underrepresentation. However, data consistently points to approximately 15% of all human trafficking cases here in the United States occurring at the hands of a parent or legal guardian. This makes the extent of family involvement in the trafficking of children up to 4 times higher than that of adults. All right. So who does this? What I'm about to say should not be surprising, as it is a reflection of demographics here in the United States. What we have found is that the commercial sexual exploitation of very young children is perpetrated by primarily white, middle class, middle-aged, religiously observant individuals living in a suburban setting. 90% of our survivors are white individuals. 80% are from Christian and Catholic families. 40% of the trafficking occurred at the hands of the mother and almost 40% at the hands of the father, leaving 15% involving a grandparent and 7% by an uncle, aunt, live-in family, friend, or foster parent. So what statistics here surprise you? Again, feel free to enter this into the chat. It's always helpful to see. So familial trafficking tends to fall into 2 categories. Half of traffickers are motivated by drug dependency, and typically children in this situation are identified during a drug trafficking investigation or as a result of neglect or truancy investigation by school or child protective services. This type of trafficking is likely to have a third party involved, exploiting the parent's vulnerability to the drug dependency. The other half are motivated by sociopathy and a malignant need for control. So within this group, it is extremely difficult to identify victims, as these traffickers tend to be well respected within their community. And in fact, almost 100% of these children are left to self-identify as survivors of trafficking during adulthood. So how do family members control and traffic their children? Tools of the familial trafficker are similar to other forms of trafficking. They work very hard to discredit their victims through gaslighting and isolation. It's common for the traffickers to instill fear of system involvement and to manipulate the education and healthcare systems to their advantage. Some do this by only trafficking the child during school breaks. Some take the child out of school altogether. It is common to isolate the child even within the walls of the home by triangulating communication patterns between family members. Most will exploit only one child at a time, leaving room to say, well, these children are not complaining, so this one must be lying or crazy. Another extremely common tool is animal abuse of beloved pets, instilling fear in the child. And another tool is to subdue children with over-the-counter cough and cold medication. The age of the child is also important. With most of the children are just so young, they don't have an accurate frame of reference. They don't understand what's going on with them, and they don't understand that it is wrong. All right. So since religious observance is so prevalent in familial trafficking homes, I want to take a moment to discuss its use as a tool by the trafficker. So 80% of these families are religiously observant, and close to 50% report religion being used as a means to facilitate their trafficking experience. So how is this done? And is this the same as ritual abuse? Well, religious abuse refers to the psychological manipulation that controls a person using the doctrine of their manipulator's religion. So when used against a child, this type of religiously based psychological abuse dominates children through fear, indoctrinating them with the abuser's beliefs while suppressing other perspectives. So within religiously abusive homes, we often see the use of authoritarian control. The parent aligns themselves with God, making themselves the utmost authority and power. Any fears and traumatic behaviors exhibited by the child can then be attributed to demonic influences. It is common for these families to use enmeshment as a means of control. Now, enmeshment is a psychological term used to describe a parent who does not allow their child to think independently or hold views that differ from their own. This on its own is toxic to the child. It inhibits a healthy formation of their own identity and crushes the child's chance to form a personal morality and belief system. When combined with the use of fear and a judgmental environment, such as the concept of hell, it makes it very easy to control the child. It makes the child literally reliant on the religion of the abuser, and they just never learn to critically reflect and think on the information that they receive. Religious abuse is very much separate from ritual abuse, where the child is sexually exploited during religious rituals. While sensational and very much real, this type of trafficking is fairly uncommon, occurring in approximately 5% of familial trafficking cases. So to put that into perspective, then less than 1% of all human trafficking in the United States would involve a ritualized sexualization of the child. So considering how low those numbers are, that's pretty much all I will say on ritual abuse, with everything else that I am mentioning also applicable to that population. Okay, so now to discuss what I refer to as a compliant parent. So it is typical for one parent to be not only non-abusive to the child, but also to be completely unaware of the trafficking, as it remains a secret between the child and the trafficker. This parent can be an asset to the child, acting as a buffer for the most severe effects of abuse on the child's development. The parent can be either male or female, and they typically have a history of childhood sexual abuse of their own. They may also have a history of trafficking, having been trafficked either themselves as an adult or as a child, but this is fairly uncommon, making intergenerational familial trafficking prevalent at around 15 to 20%. So that brings us to the other siblings in the family. As I mentioned before, a tool to isolate a child is to only target one sibling at a time. This is true in 65% of such families, with only 15% of trafficking survivors stating that their siblings were aware of the abuse and perhaps being trafficked themselves. All right. Let's move along to where this happens. It is important to mention the locations of abuse, as I do not want anyone to leave this presentation believing that anywhere is immune to trafficking. In fact, outside of the child's home and the buyer's home, church was the most common location mentioned in our survivor community. This was not in reference to ritualized abuse, but more because trafficking could occur within a religious setting without drawing suspicion. It just simply does not occur to people who are in a place of worship that a child could be being trafficked out of a coat closet somewhere, with the buyer just not drawing attention to themselves, as religious institutions tend to welcome newcomers. All right. So let's move along to behavioral indicators and barriers to disclosure. So how do you think a familial trafficking victim appears? How will they behave? Again, feel free to respond in the chat box. Always curious to see what people think. This is a good time to discuss adverse childhood experiences, which we will go into greater detail tomorrow. It is agreed upon in trauma literature that the impact of trauma on the developing mind has lifelong consequences, and the impact of repeated instances of traumatic events have a cumulative effect. This leads to a unique constellation of deficits across developmental domains. These events strongly disrupt neurodevelopment, cognitive functioning, emotional regulation, social ability, and even communication skills, leading to a wide range of health disorders and dysfunctions in adulthood, including psychopathy. So we see the average age of entry into trafficking for this population being 5 years of age, with the grooming process typically going on for years prior to the first trafficking experience. The average survivor spends 10 years being exploited by the family member, only to have continued contact with them into adulthood. As a result, the child's cognitive functioning and their ability to cope with negative emotions are compromised. Due to the chronic and severe nature of adverse experiences, including the age of entry and ongoing exposure to the trafficker, these individuals are at high risk for developing psychopathy and functional impairment in adulthood. So over time, often appearing in adolescence, but sometimes sooner, the child begins to adopt unhealthy coping mechanisms such as substance abuse and self-harm. So before I go further, I want to discuss system involvement, particularly homeschooling as a tool for isolation by traffickers who manipulate the system. Actually, I'll go back to the previous slide for this. So a 2018 focus group in Louisiana identified homeschool children as a group at high risk for sex trafficking. Our SAFE group shows this as well, with members being homeschooled at 5 times the rate of the national average, which is highly concerning given the current trends of virtual learning. One reason behind this is that abusers will use lax homeschooling laws pulling children from school so that they cannot report ongoing abuse, and so that their behaviors do not seem suspicious to those who are knowledgeable about such things. We see that familial trafficking victims are likely to be evaluated by school personnel for a variety of reasons. So I want to point out what sticks out to me. 85% panic disorders, 100% sleep disturbances, 75% self-harm, 65% are a victim of bullying, with the rest are usually the bully, the other 35%. 65% have difficult maintaining friendships, 50% attempt suicide, 43% have a very high absentee rate, and 60% receive either an LD, which is a learning disability, or an ADD diagnosis. The nurse will also typically field frequent complaints of vague somatic issues. This is referred to as somatization, primarily of stomach pain. There it is. You can see how confusing this would be to school personnel, right? All right, so barriers to disclosure. I mentioned the young age of the victim as a barrier to disclosing abuse. Lack of frame of reference makes it very difficult for the child. Traumatic stress causes cognitive dysfunction, primarily in the form of memory loss and disassociation. This protects the child from the emotional pain associated with the event. Traffickers work very hard to ensure that the child fears system involvement, including law enforcement, school personnel, healthcare workers, and social workers. The trafficker will typically sit in with the child during mental or physical evaluations, particularly when the concern is related to a trafficking event, such as a UTI. We also discussed how substances are used to create a barrier to disclosure. These substances make the trafficking experience fuzzy and dreamlike, and these type of over-the-counter medications are readily accessible and used in 75% of such cases. Another huge barrier is ongoing contact with the trafficker post-trafficking. 75% of victims continue to have contact with the trafficking parent even after the abuse has ended. So this speaks volumes to just how difficult it is to protect oneself from ongoing exposure to the perpetrator, and represents an enduring threat to the psychological and physical safety of the survivor. Right. So now that we have discussed such heavy dynamics, I'd like to move to a more preferred section of the presentation, at least for myself. This is intervention. So children are not equipped to identify or defend themselves from abusers and exploiters. Similar to studies of exploited adolescents, there is a high rate of arousal and dissociation compared to just sexual abuse alone. And this contributes to the idea that sex trafficking causes additional harm to young people, making it difficult to self-identify and report due to retrospective recall, memory distortion, and misperceptions of what human trafficking actually is. In addition, the fear of the trafficker is really strong barrier to intervening. Most survivors report trying to tell an adult about the experience at some point during their trafficking. They typically try to tell a non-abusive caretaker, school or church personnel, or someone else with whom they have established an ongoing connection with. Because they are children with a lack of cognition and communication skills, they might try to tell you in an indirect manner. They might say things like, I don't want to go, or I think something bad will happen, or I keep having the same nightmare. These are ways the child is telling you that they feel unsafe. And you should always honor the child's safety and concerns, particularly when it has to do with a family member. Okay, so intervention will typically have several stages, ranging from immediate to long-term. So again, in the chat box, what should you do if you suspect a child may be victim of familial exploitation? Let's see if people have any theories. So my suggestion is that you never try to intervene directly, as that will put you in danger. So rather establish a safe, predictable, transparent relationship with the child. Make sure they know they can trust you and ask you questions about how they are feeling. And in the meantime, you can call the human trafficking hotline, as well as make a report for child abuse with your local agency. I have included New Jersey specific numbers here at the bottom of the slide. If you are in another state and are having difficulty locating the child abuse reporting system for your state, feel free to contact us and we will try to assist you in finding that information. So once confirmed, safety, both physical and psychological, will be paramount to the victim. Then what follows is a lifetime of hard work with an emphasis on choice, strengths, and regulation of the central nervous system. So all of this we will discuss in much greater detail tomorrow, including the evidence behind these recommendations. So perhaps the greatest gift you can provide a survivor of familial exploitation is a reliable relationship over an extended period of time, including assisting them in connecting with other survivors. This connection is probably the single most healing element outside of regulation. Without the connection, it's impossible to establish the trust and social skills that are needed to successfully navigate the world and life in general. So we discussed individualized intervention strategies. And here I want to discuss community intervention ideas. So we should drop the idea that some families and some locations are immune to trafficking. There are reasons to believe that certain locations are hotbeds for the commercial sexual exploitation of young children, as identification may be hampered by a lack of awareness, training, and record keeping. Stakeholders should be trained in the presentation of developmental trauma. And again, this is something we'll go over in greater detail tomorrow. There is a need for agencies and individuals to acknowledge that family members do profit off of and facilitate the commercial exploitation of very young children, and that this absolutely is human trafficking. So it's important to make sure your child welfare personnel are not operating in a vacuum. They need specialized training and support to accurately label these cases. Increasing awareness surrounding familial exploitation. So this can be done by including family-specific trafficking in any anti-trafficking presentation, and not in just a way that is glossed over. Too often I hear that survivors attend these presentations on human trafficking and leave being unable to identify, as the material was not applicable to their own experience. You can modify any screening tools you are currently using to include dissociation, and not just diagnosing for attention or learning differences. So screening for dissociation will get to the root cause of attention and learning differences. Specifically, when you combine this with frequent visits to the school nurse, high absentee rate, school district hopping, and other manipulation of the school systems, including homeschooling and opting for virtual school enrollment. Parents who are identified as being substance dependent by any agency should also be screened for familial sex involvement, remembering that this type of trafficking is likely to include a third party. Thus, screening should include other people who are in the life of the parent who may be exploiting that person's drug dependence as a way to gain access to the child. You should always believe children, honoring their boundaries and requests, assisting heads of households in making the best long-term plans for themselves and their children. Labeling sex trafficking as sex trafficking and not just sex abuse. This is important for a lot of reasons. The data is helpful for prevalence, and offenders tend to receive a punishment that is compatible with their crimes instead of something for a lesser offense. In addition, this helps the victim be able to properly understand their experience, framing it appropriately, and seeking out treatment that is helpful instead of moot.